side here and in the chat. Lauren Parmalee, great to see Lauren from ASRI again. My name's Matt Schenck. I was the vice president of the Ocean State Bird Club for several years. I think it was 2016 through 2020. And I'm really excited to be broadcasting to y'all live from Smethport, Pennsylvania. Cold and snowy Smethport. It snowed most of the day today, so we get lake effect snow here off Lake Erie. If y'all aren't familiar with Pennsylvania geography, Smethport is about 2 hours east of Lake Erie and about 30 minutes south of the New York border. So we live in northern Pennsylvania now, right in the heart of the Pennsylvania Wilds, which is a big expanse of public land. There's thousands of acres of state forest, and we live really close to Allegheny National Forest as well. So really excited to be broadcasting from Smethport and excited to do a talk tonight on Zoom on shorebirds of Rhode Island. We're going to talk about what are shorebirds, identifying shorebirds, how to find shorebirds, where to look, and this is all going to focus on Rhode Island, obviously, because y'all are the Ocean State Bird Club. I see a lot of folks saying hi from the chat box. Just want to say hi to all of y'all. I'm really excited to see so many familiar names and faces. And if we're ready, I'll go ahead and get started with my PowerPoint. Sound good, Mike?
Yeah, that sounds great, bud.
All righty. All right. So let's see. There we go. Okay, so shorebirds of the Ocean State. So tonight I've got a presentation here, and we will break this up. There's a lot of slides. I know it can, be drowning listening to somebody talk for an hour straight. So we will break it up for questions throughout. You don't have to save until the end. Just go ahead and throw them in the chat box, like Mike said. So we're going to start off answering a basic question. What is a shorebird? What makes them different from birds that are at the shore? We'll move on and talk about shorebird season. So the time of year to look for shorebirds and what you might find and what they might look like depending on the time of year. We'll talk identification station. I'll go over a little bit more clearly what specifically we're going to talk about in the identification section, but most of the time for the PowerPoint, we'll talk about identification and also finding shorebirds. So these first two sections we'll move through pretty quickly and then spend most of our time focusing on identification and finding shorebirds and also some specific Rhode Island locations. All right. So the first question that we have to answer is, what is a shorebird? Being that Rhode Island is the ocean state, I'm assuming that most of you have spent some time birding at the shore. You probably realize there's a lot of different kinds of birds that you can find on the shore. So ducks, gulls, herons, sandpipers, plovers. I've even seen warblers down on the sand at the beach and in the mud flats, and also sparrows. And it's important to note that shorebirds are not just simply birds that are found at the shore. They can also be found away from the shore, but there are some specific characteristics that these birds have that separate them from sort of those other birds at the shore, like gulls, ducks, or herons. So they are typically found in wet habitats. Shorebirds like water. Almost all of them are pretty much glued to it. And specifically, they like wet substrates, so mud and sand. Shorebirds also typically have longer legs for wading in the water or wading in wet substrate. I guess I should mention the species as well. The first species there was a least sandpiper, and the second one is a stilt sandpiper, which is a good one to showcase long legs. The name implicates that the long legs like stilts. Shorebirds also typically have longer bills. They use their bills to pick and probe for food, which is typically invertebrates. That's important to separate them from longer billed birds like herons, which focus on vertebrate prey like fish, amphibians, and small reptiles. Shorebirds are going after things like bugs and things in the sand like worms and different invertebrates, and sometimes bivalves as well. One last characteristic that sort of separates shorebirds is that nearly all of the shorebirds found in North America actually nest on the ground. So this is a killdeer nest. This was from Great Swamp Management Area in West Kingston. So like almost all other shorebirds, they nest on the ground. You notice I said typically and almost a lot. There's always exceptions. So just some exceptions to those rules: killdeer, buff-breasted sandpiper, Baird's sandpiper, upland sandpiper. They actually like dry habitats, so they can be found anywhere from parking lots to turf fields. They're not necessarily glued to water, although you might find them at water too. Species like purple sandpipers and American woodcocks don't have particularly long legs. They're kind of short and stubby. Plovers in general don't have super long bills, but they do use them to pick and probe for food. So they use their bill in the same manner, it's just shorter. And one species in North America does not nest on the ground. And this is a real fun fact. Solitary sandpipers, which breed in the northern forests of Canada, actually use abandoned passerine nests. So picture this species sitting on eggs in an abandoned American robin nest in a Canadian forest. It seems kind of wacky, but this is the only species in North America and one of only 2 or 3 on Earth that don't nest on the ground. And the other 2 are actually very closely related old world species. So for some reason, the small Tringa group really doesn't want to nest on the ground. They're kind of outliers with that, but there's always some exceptions to those characteristics. But primarily, most shorebirds are going to have all or most of those characteristics ticked off on the box. Just take a quick break right at the beginning. Does anybody have any questions about what a shorebird is or what makes a shorebird a shorebird? This specific species here is a western subspecies of willet. We'll talk a little bit more about willets later. But Mike, was there any questions from that early kind of intro?
There's nothing in the chat, Matt, so feel free if anybody wants to unmute and just ask a question to Matt. I'm sure he'll be happy to answer.
All right. We will move on to shorebird season from there. And this, we'll spend a little bit more time in this section than the last section, but not too much. We want to get on to that identification piece as well. So I will say, as somebody who lives away from the ocean, a lot of places in North America have a very specific set time frame during the year where shorebirds are prevalent, and there are not very many of them around outside of that period. Rhode Island is unique in on the same way that all coastal areas in the lower 48 are, in that you can find shorebirds 12 months out of the year in the state of Rhode Island. So you could be doing a big day in January and you can tick shorebirds on Third Beach and end up with frosty beard. You could also be looking for shorebirds in late August and relaxing in the water in Charlestown. So this is actually a really great thing about birding in Rhode Island, is if you're looking for shorebirds, it doesn't really matter the time of year. You can walk out and find them, but what species you find and what they look like when you find them depends heavily on the time of year that you're looking. So that's what we're going to focus on in the shorebird season piece. So first, we'll focus on what each species is going to look like at different times of the year, and we'll focus on some plumage terms. So the first term we have is basic plumage. Basic plumage is non-breeding, or sometimes considered winter plumage. It depends on the species. Winter may be the breeding season for some species, but basic is what we would refer to as non-breeding plumage. It's typically pretty dull. This is a Dunlin in February from Third Beach in Middletown. It's very drab gray, got a white belly, some darker browns and grays on the wing as well, but very nondescript. It's a plumage that helps the bird stay camouflaged and avoid predation during the non-breeding season. Now, alternate plumage is very different. It's brighter. This is the same species of Dunlin. This is immediately following the breeding season. I took this photo in July, early July, I believe, at Napatree Point. This is a alternate plumage Dunlin. You see the really bright orange feathers across the back. It's got a black belly, an orange crown. So the same species can look radically different plumage-wise, depending on the time of year. If you see a Dunlin in the winter, it's going to be cold, gray, nondescript, versus a Dunlin in the early summer is going to be very bright in alternate plumage. Also want to mention plumage wear. So we have fresh plumage, which describes birds that have just recently molted. This is a fresh alternate sanderling on Third Beach in Middletown. This photo was taken in mid-May, I think, so right before the breeding season. This individual was on its way to the Arctic, where it was going to find a mate and breed. And then you also have worn plumage, which is just like it sounds. It's raggedy. The bird is molting out of that fresh plumage. This is an adult sanderling that is in mid-migration south from the breeding season. I actually took this picture in central Pennsylvania last summer in August. And typically with fresh versus worn, when we're talking about adults, fresh alternate plumage is what we see during spring migration and very early in summer. And worn adults are what we see throughout most of fall migration until they get into that basic non-breeding plumage. Juveniles are a little bit different. We see fresh juvenile plumage during fall migration when the birds are returning from where they were hatched. They have a fresh juvenile plumage, and then they molt out of that into a basic plumage in the winter. And I'll mention these plumages a little bit in the specific time frames. I chose Dunlin and sanderling, not just because I had pictures that showed the contrasting plumage states, but because in the wintertime, that's December through March, those are the two most common species you're going to find in the state of Rhode Island. You have sanderling on the right in basic plumage. It's very nondescript, a very pale bird. It blends in really well with the sand, which is where you're going to find a sanderling on the sand. They like the beaches. If you've been to any of the state beaches, Third Beach in Middletown as well, and seen little pale sandpipers chasing the waves and then running away from the waves, those are sanderlings. And fun fact, sanderlings are actually found in Rhode Island 12 months out of the year. So they're just kind of a species that seems to always be around. But in winter, they're definitely the most common species in Rhode Island. Followed by Dunlin, which are occasionally found on the beach with sanderlings. They have a longer, droopier bill, and they've got more of a brown plumage compared to the pale sanderling. I don't know if y'all can hear the fire whistles in my town going off, but that's fun. My apartment's not on fire, so we're doing okay. So these are the two most common species. Dunlin typically like salt marshes in the winter, but they will come out on the beaches with sanderlings, but you'll see them more in marshes on mudflats. Some other common species that are around that might take a little bit more searching. You have purple sandpipers. I photographed this one at Salty Brine State Beach, right on the seawall. Right by the parking lot. They like rocky beaches. They kind of pick the rocks for invertebrates, and they hang out right where the waves crash. So Satchwas Point National Wildlife Refuge, Beaver Tail, Point Judith, also down into westerly on the Rocky Coast. You can find purple sandpipers in the winter. And another common species that you find is Ruddy Turnstone, which is a little bit unique. It has a shorter bill for flipping over stones, hence the name Turnstone. And this is actually a basic plumage Ruddy Turnstone. The menu photo that I used to kind of show what section of the talk we're in is actually one that's molting out of alternate plumage. So they get this really cool bright white head and red body feathers in the summertime when they're breeding or when they're passing through for the breeding season, but they're here in the winter too. They're very hardy birds. Oftentimes Ruddy Turnstones are found with purple sandpipers on the rocks, but they'll also come into sandy beaches. And some other species that are sometimes present in the winter, you can typically find killdeer. Sometimes you can find greater yellowlegs, depends on the winter. And then Also, black-bellied plover is another one that you might expect to see hanging around in the winter as well. So after March, we get into spring migration, which typically runs from April to early June. And spring migration starts with our breeding species, as they tend to start trickling in earlier than the migrant species that are going further north. There's actually very few species of shorebirds that breed in Rhode Island. There's over 30 species that you can find in Rhode Island throughout the year, but only a couple of them actually breed here. One of them is piping plovers. Usually piping plovers like this one show up on the beach in March. I think this was my first piping plover in 2015. I think this was like March 25th or something like that. They show up on the beach, start courting, and they'll start nesting into April and May. And then following that initial wave of breeding species that are returning to the state to breed, we start to see more of the migrant species that are migrating through Rhode Island and heading to points further north to actually breed. So those numbers pick up starting getting closer to May, and then moving into late May. And then some of those migrants will actually decide not to go all the way to the breeding grounds. They figure they're not going to make it, and they'll hang around in the state in the early summer as well. But typically, our breeding species dominate that early summer period. Speaking of early summer basically means June. Now, technically, summer doesn't start until June 21st, but summer in a breeding bird term is much earlier than that. It starts right around the beginning of June. And this is a period that's dominated by breeding species. And some of those that you might find during this period that are really prevalent, we have the eastern subspecies of willets, which breed in salt marshes. So you can find them around Ninigret Pond, any of the salt ponds in South County, salt marshes and on Aquidneck Island, and even up into the bay a little ways. You'll find them in, say, Allen Harbor in North Kingstown. You can see them flying around there as well. We also have American oyster catchers, which breed in the state. These are a large, distinctive species that we're going to talk about during identification. And then, like I mentioned, piping plovers. Just so you can get an idea, the breeding season is not condensed to just the month of June. It's just that these species are here in June and starting to breed. They'll raise chicks in the state right up through the end of summer, so into August. And you'll notice if you're out looking for shorebirds later in summer, there could be a lot of migrant shorebirds, but not very many of those species are actually breeding. And one way to tell is if you're at the Charlestown Breachway in late July or early August, you could have 20 species of shorebirds in front of you, but there's only going to be one species that's making a racket, yelling at you, possibly flying at you and trying to distract you, and that's willets. And that's because willets are the only species in that salt marsh that are shorebirds that are going to actually be breeding there. All those other birds are going to be migrants that are passing through. All right, finally, fall migration. If you're going to have a quote unquote season for shorebirding, fall migration is definitely the time frame. It's very long. In Rhode Island, you start seeing migrant adult shorebirds as early as the first week in July. I know a lot of birders mark the 4th of July on their calendar, and they can't wait to start looking for shorebirds. I always mark the 1st of July. That's when you're going to start seeing those adult shorebirds that are trickling in. And fun fact, we oftentimes have a vision of the parental skills of birds that's based on passerines that we see around our houses or in the forest, where they're caring for these nearly helpless young for several weeks, and then they're still caring for them while they're flying around. Shorebirds are very different. They nest on the ground, their young hatch out, and they can walk and run and feed themselves immediately. It's what we call precocial young. And they are mostly nesting around the Arctic Circle or in the Arctic or far northern Canada, where the daylight hours are very long. So they can spend almost 24 hours a day leading the young around, finding food and helping protect them from predators. And once those young fledge, the adults abandon them pretty immediately. They don't typically migrate together. The adults start flooding down into Rhode Island in early July, and we don't see the first juveniles until later in July. So the juveniles are hanging out together in the north, trying to figure out when they're going to start migrating, and they don't typically have adults to show them the way. It's really an interesting dynamic, but we start seeing these worn adults early in July. We start seeing juveniles coming in with really fresh juvenile plumage, like these red knots, starting towards the end of July and especially into August. You can tell this is a fresh juvenile. If you look at the markings on the feathers, it's got those really fine, scaly patterns. Adults that are migrating off the breeding grounds look worn and ratty. They're not going to look this nice. So these are juvenile red knots. Later on towards August and especially into September, we start getting some regular but really nice species that everybody's looking for, such as buff-breasted sandpipers. This is a species that you're just as likely to find in a dry habitat like a turf field as you are in a salt marsh. This photo was taken in the salt marsh though. Again, look at how intricate and fine the plumage is. That's definitely a juvenile bird. It's coming through. An adult would be much more worn and ratty looking. And then this is also the time where we might expect to see some shorebirds that are really less common. Sometimes we don't even see them over the course of a year. And speaking of adults, this was actually an adult that showed up in Charlestown a couple of years ago. This is a red Falarop, a species that migrates primarily over the ocean. So it doesn't actually hop down along coastal shorelines like a lot of species. It actually just migrates over the water. It'll land on the water and find food that way. But this adult red Falarop, and again, we can tell it's an adult because it's coming into its basic plumage. In alternate plumage, red Phalarops are very red. So the name is not a misnomer. This is actually just an adult that's molting out of its breeding plumage, and it's actually almost into its basic plumage. So that's fall migration, and that can go all the way to November. We find some species like white-rumped sandpipers and long-billed dowitchers, even avocets late into November and sometimes even into December. So this period of migration lasts a long time. Oftentimes there's waves of birds depending on conditions. So you might have a day where you go to the Charlestown Breachway in September and not see much. And then the next day you show up and there's 5,000 birds on the mudflats. So these waves of migration is going on for several months. And depending on the timing, you get different species and different makeup of adults and juveniles. All right, Mike, any questions so far?
There's no questions at this point, Matt, but there was one from Sandy a while back, and there was a bird you had at the beginning. It was a short-legged. Can you identify that bird again?
I think we were talking about the purple sandpiper. So that would have been one of the exception slide that I highlighted for not having exceptionally long legs. That's the purple sandpiper, and that one was photographed at Salty Brine State Beach on the seawall in Galilee.
Okay, Matt, there's no more questions. A couple people have to leave, so obviously they're missing you and missing your presentation. This is being recorded, so it will be up on our website, on our YouTube channel. So please, you can always come back.
Ooh, Jana's raising her hand.
Jana, you're muted. Go ahead, unmute.
I unmuted my video. I mean, I opened, you can't see me, but.
No, we can't.
Yeah, I wondered, Matt, do you know, as climate change progresses, has anybody determined, I mean, what triggers the migration? Is it temperature? Is it daylight?
So some of these birds are migrating from a different hemisphere to the northern hemisphere. And actually, a lot of the shorebirds that we see passing through Rhode Island over winter in South America and in the Caribbean on the equator. So for those that are away from the equator, I think that daylight or that amount of time of daylight or darkness per day plays a role. It's probably a combination of factors. I don't know the exact makeup of it, but there's a lot of research that suggests that the phenology of both plants and animals is heavily tied to the length of day or length of night. So I'm not sure exactly, for each individual shorebird species, it might be different. It probably depends on where they overwinter. But that is one thing to keep in mind, when you're thinking about early migrants that might be coming in and like a late season snowstorm, a lot of them are coming from further away. So they don't necessarily respond to like a prolonged period of cold weather in Rhode Island if they're coming from Florida, unless it's also cold there. But temperature also plays a role, a combination of temperature, daylight length, and other factors. Food availability also plays a role. So these species have really dynamic internal clocks that I am definitely not in the know enough to understand fully, but I know it's a combination of factors.
I was thinking in the Arctic, which is warming much faster.
Yeah, and
birds are breeding there and fledging. If there's more food longer, would that possibly delay their migration?
Potentially, yeah. And the patterns of climate change in the Arctic create problems for breeding shorebirds as well. It's a very complex issue. It's not necessarily just like a warmer Arctic and more food availability. So a warmer Arctic is less stable. So you also have a warming Arctic that occasionally throws more extreme cold weather in the middle of the summer, which is really bad for breeding shorebirds. And it also, the cycle of warm and cold is really important for the food chain that these birds rely on. So a lot of these invertebrates are depending on plankton blooms that depend on a regular cycle of cold and warm that happens at certain times. So if it warms up early, the plankton may bloom, and that bloom may have ended, and you might have a drought of invertebrates for food. So climate change definitely presents a very complex issue for these birds in terms of both migration and breeding in the Arctic. Thanks, Jana.
Okay, Matt, there's nothing else in the chat, so feel free to continue your presentation.
All right, we'll go ahead and move on to identification station. And I want to just be really clear, there are over 30 regularly occurring species of shorebirds in Rhode Island that either migrate through or breed in the state. So I can't possibly cover all 30 of those species in the amount of time that we have here. So I am going to focus on a tiered approach to identification. So I'm going to invoke a birding meme for this. Got the expanding brain meme. We'll talk a little bit about some of the large diagnostic species that are really easy to identify. If you're new to shorebirds, these are species that even just seeing a photo here, you should probably be able to identify them in the field. Then we'll move on to some more challenging groups like the yellowlegs and their lookalikes. Finally, we'll continue to move down through more challenging identification groups. The Pluvialis Plovers, that's our black-bellied and American golden plover in Rhode Island. Our Peeps, or our small sandpipers. And finally, the toughest identification challenge that I really experienced while I was in Rhode Island is the dowitchers, short-billed versus long-billed. And we're going to cover each of these sections kind of individually, and there'll be some question periods between each one. So if you're taking notes, don't worry, you can ask questions in between each section. And also, as Michael said, this is recorded, and I've got some information on resources for identification at the end as well. So we'll start off with our large diagnostic species. Probably the most diagnostic species that occurs in Rhode Island is also one of the most common. It's a breeding species. This is an American oyster catcher. They're big, they stand almost 2 feet tall. They've got a big, hefty orange bill, bright yellow eye, orange orbital ring, and a black head. They're very distinctive. Nothing else in the state of Rhode Island looks like an American oyster catcher. And it's the only species of oyster catcher that occurs in the East Coast. There is another species, black oyster catcher, that occurs on the West Coast. We don't see them in Rhode Island, even as vagrants. So an American oyster catcher is your quintessential large diagnostic species. It's pretty easy ID. Another diagnostic species that's fairly easy to identify is American Avocets. It's another large species, pretty tall, very long legs, These two are actually in basic plumage, so non-breeding. This is a photo from November. This is a pair of birds that Bob Weaver found back in 2015. And the only difference between breeding and alternate plumage is that the adults in alternate plumage have an orange head. So the black and white wings and the dramatic white belly and body contrasting with the black and white wings is all still prevalent. And most importantly, the thin upturned bill that they use to sweep through the water and catch crustaceans like shrimp is still present. So American avocet is another species that's a fairly simple ID. There's not really anything else in Rhode Island that looks anything like them. We also have one really large godwit species. This is marbled godwit. There is one other godwit species that's a lot more uncommon, Hudsonian godwit, which migrates primarily over the ocean. We do see a couple of them per year, but they're smaller and less diagnostic. Marbled godwits are pretty big. They've got these long upturned bicolored bills, cinnamony brown plumage. They're a very distinctive bird on the mudflat. Typically, if you're looking at a godwit, it's going to be the biggest shorebird that you could see, unless you're really lucky and you've got a godwit and an avocet right next to each other. That would be the exception. So these guys are really massive in terms of shorebirds, a lot bigger than most of our regular migrants or breeding species. Even willets are smaller than marbled godwit. All right, and finally, one of my favorites from the large diagnostic species category. This is a Wimbrel. Another big, tall species, close to 2 feet tall. It's got a long, distinctive bill, distinctive because it's down curved, which most shorebirds have straight bills. Some of them have upturned bills, but Wimbrel is one of a few that have this very strongly decurved bill. And they also have a striped head. One thing I will mention is that the bill length in a Wimbrel can vary quite a bit. So I believe this one is an adult. And sometimes the juveniles especially can have really short bills like this individual, but still really down curved, striped crown, tall bird, similar plumage to the godwit, but with that striped crown, it's very distinctive. Any questions from our diagnostic species section, Mike?
No, there's nothing other than some compliments on the photography. So,
oh, thank you.
Photography.
All right. So we'll move on to some. Oh, Janice got a question. Yeah.
Sorry.
Nope,
No, it's just, I know some of these shorebirds are more, some of them are come every year, but they're fewer in number. Some are much more occasional.
Yep.
Could you just mention as you're going along which ones, like we're more likely to see?
Yeah.
Kind of a casual birder and not going out there every day.
Yeah, definitely. The oyster catcher is one that you will you'll see very frequently in Rhode Island. They're a breeding species. They're fairly common. They're around for a long period of time. They start showing up in April and they can be here through November sometimes. Your avocets are annual in Rhode Island. They're not common, but there's usually several that show up, and it's what most birders would consider a chase bird. So you hear about one and you show up. So if you find one, that's a good find, but they are here every year. They do migrate through Rhode Island. Marbled godwit, more common than avocets. Typically, there's a handful to a dozen or so. This particular group, there were 3 of them that hung around for a couple of days, put on a real show. But again, a good find in Rhode Island. Wimbrel is a bird that attracts a lot of attention because they're big and really cool looking, and it's always nice to find them, add them to your year list. But they are fairly common. Most years I would see upwards of half a dozen of them just myself. If you're in the right place around migration time, they're a species that's passing through Rhode Island in decent enough numbers that you have a good shot at seeing one. Thanks, Jana. Any other questions? All right. Well, we'll keep moving right along into our more challenging identifications. So we have the yellow legs and the lookalikes. There are several different groups of shorebirds, sandpipers, plovers. The yellow legs are in a group called the Tringas, the genus Tringa. So they are two species in Rhode Island. You have the greater yellow legs, which is the more common species throughout the year. Sometimes they'll be here in the wintertime, depending on the winter, but they're very common through summer and through migration. They're a larger species with kind of a bulky head, a thick neck, and a long bill that typically looks like it's upturned versus a straight bill. And compared that to the lesser yellow legs, which is a smaller species, typically occurs during migration, sometimes in really high numbers. It's certainly not an uncommon species, but typically lesser yellow legs are around than greater yellow legs. But you are also likely during migration to see big flocks of lesser yellow legs. You'll notice on the lesser yellow legs on the right side that they've got longer wings. They've got a thinner bill that's straight and shorter. So greater yellow legs bill is usually 2 times the length of the bill is usually 2 times the width of the head, versus the lesser yellow legs, which bill is usually the same length as the width of the head, or up to 1.5 times the width of the head, but it's thin and straight, more like a needle and less thick than the greater yellow legs. And then you'll also notice that the lesser yellow legs has kind of a smaller, daintier head and just a daintier appearance. Now, these two species can also be reliably identified by voice. So I do have some examples of the calls that I'm going to pull up. And I'm going to use the eBird Macaulay library to play those calls. So this is the greater yellow legs, which has a really harsh punchy call that's oftentimes paired or tripled. So this is what that sounds like. It's typically described as a 2-2-2. And yellow legs are really famous for being very talkative. They're very noisy birds. So if you see them in the salt marsh, you're likely to also hear them. Now your lesser yellow legs is going to have a softer call that's usually only single notes or paired notes, but it's softer, it's less harsh, it doesn't have the same punch that you hear from the greater yellow legs. So I just wanted to point that out, that some species can actually be reliably identified by ear. And we're going to pan back out to that, those eBird recordings in a little bit when we talk about dowitchers as well, because that's a reliable way to identify dowitchers as well. So it can be challenging to pick apart greater versus lesser yellow legs, but there's also some birds that aren't really related to them, but are kind of similar. So you have these species that also have yellow legs, but aren't actually yellow legs. So this is a Calidris. This is a sandpiper. It's a stilt sandpiper. You can see it's got yellow legs, and this one is in basic plumage or molting into basic plumage, which is very gray, just like our lesser and greater yellow legs. And it's got kind of that longish bill, sort of tapered tip. But if you look closely, you'll see the bill is actually decurved a little bit. And it has a really strong eyebrow or supercilium, which neither of our yellow legs had. And when they're standing right next to each other, stilt sandpiper is actually a little bit smaller than a lesser yellow leg. So this is a lesser yellow legs on the right and a stilt sandpiper on the left. And that is a really good example showing the bill structure as well, how the stilt sandpiper's bill kind of droops down. Stilt sandpiper is a regular migrant in Rhode Island. But they are less common than both of the yellow legs. So stilt sandpiper, less common than the yellow legs. They do sometimes hang out in flocks of yellow legs. I've seen quite a few of them that way. They like similar habitats where they feed and forage for similar types of food. So you are likely to find them with yellow legs, but they are less common. Another one that's got yellow legs, this is another sandpiper, Calidris. This is a pectoral sandpiper. It's one of the bigger peeps. So it approaches stilt sandpiper's size. It's smaller than stilt sandpiper and a little shorter legged. So just on structure alone, you're probably not going to confuse it with the yellow legs, but if you get caught looking at the legs, you can kind of get to that conclusion. A couple of things to look at. This is a fresh juvenile pectoral sandpiper. This is a fall migrant. You see the really nice fresh plumage with the orange outlines on the black feathers and the nice crown feathering that's orange. Yellow legs are never going to have this much color. They're always going to be that grayish brown and white. Even fresh birds are not going to have this much rufous and orange in any of the feathering. So a fresh juvenile pectoral sandpiper you can tell apart. An adult pectoral sandpiper is going to be more of a chocolatey brown, which again is different from that brown gray that you're going to see on lesser yellow legs, and it definitely contrasts if you were to see them together. And then finally, there is another lookalike that's actually related to the yellow legs, your solitary sandpiper. It's another tringa, and they have olivey legs, and sometimes they're brighter and could be confused with yellow depending on the lighting. They do also structurally kind of look similar to lesser yellow legs. They are smaller though, and you'll notice that the bill slightly decurves on solitary sandpipers, and solitary sandpipers have a very strong eye ring with spectacles that you can kind of see here. It kind of looks like it's got a pair of white glasses wraps around the eye. And lastly, solitary is more of a brown than a gray. So you can see on this bird, it's got brown with flecks of white in it versus a mostly gray background with a little bit of brown and white flecked in as well. All right, any questions about yellow legs and the lookalikes?
So Dan, there was a comment in the chat from Devin. He said, I believe the lesser yellow legs fly in a series of 3 snappy wing beats and then glide, and greater yellow legs do not. Can you make a comment on that?
I have not heard that, but it definitely is something to be considered. Flight style is a great point of identification for a variety of species. Spotted sandpipers fly with really fluttery wingtips, kind of low over the water, versus other species that might fly differently. I haven't personally, well, I've observed yellow legs doing that flight pattern, so I can confirm they definitely do that. I don't know that graders don't, but lessers definitely do. And I will say one piece of advice that I will shout from the rooftops for folks that are looking to identify shorebirds is do not stop looking at them when they're flying. I know that they're a tough group to identify even when they're on the ground, but a lot of times the species will give you clues in flight that are really easy to see and that you might not be able to see when they're on the ground. And we'll talk about that a little bit longer, but that's a good observation, Devin. So more power to you if you can confirm that that's the case. That would be awesome. Yeah. Anything else?
Thank you. That was it. And that was actually very good advice about keeping an eye on flight. I think that's something that many of us, me included, will quickly divert and look for something on the shore. Here's another one from Barbara. Barbara said, I don't recall hearing about a stilt sandpiper in the area last year. Do you have any site suggestions for that?
Stilt sandpiper is kind of an interesting one. They, they're annual in Rhode Island. They do typically take a little bit of searching to find. Anywhere you see a lot of lesser yellow legs is a good spot to start. I will say the most reliable single place other than the Charlestown Breachway that I've had stilt sandpiper is a seasonal site that's not always productive. It depends on the water level, but it's from the Norman Bird Sanctuary's Nelson Pond Trail. The Nelson Pond Reservoir behind Gardner Pond in Middletown. If the water level is low in August and September, especially, the back of that pond that's visible from the Nelson Pond Trail is a very reliable stilt sandpiper location.
Great. Great suggestions, Matt. No other questions in the chat. So if anybody else has something, you raise your hand or feel free to unmute.
Okay, moving right along. Pluvialis Plovers. Disclosure, there are more than 2 species of Pluvialis Plovers that we might come in contact with in North America. In Rhode Island, there's really only 2 that you're likely to see. That's black-bellied plover, which this one is. This is a plover from Sue Palmer, who I think is in the audience. and American golden plover. The other two that you might run into, if you're really lucky on the East Coast, you might get a European golden plover, and also there's a Pacific golden plover. But again, in Rhode Island, way more likely to be black-bellied or an American golden. And for the most part, black-bellied is far more common year-round than American golden plover. There's a short period of time, actually it's an extended period of time during fall migration, starting around late August and running through early November, where American golden are also prevalent. But black-bellied plover is a species that could be present at any time during the year, and it's typically, even when American goldens are coming through, black-bellied is going to be more common. And this is a worn adult that Sue photographed. I'm guessing this is a picture from Napatree Point. Those look like Napatree oyster beds. But alternate adult Pluvialis Plovers in terms of black-bellied and American golden are fairly straightforward in terms of identification. On the top, we have an adult black-bellied plover, and on the bottom, we have an adult American golden plover. So the black-bellied, you'll notice, is a heftier looking bird. That's because it has a heftier bill. It's got a bigger head, a thicker neck, and shorter wings that kind of get at that squat, hefty appearance. Our American golden plover is more of a lean bird. It's got a smaller head, thinner bill, thinner neck, and much longer wings that kind of stretches the bird out and gives it sort of a lean appearance. But the easiest way to tell these two apart in the breeding season is the undertail and vent area. Black-bellied plovers have black bellies, but white undertail. American golden plovers have black bellies and black undertails. Now, this is a really easy identification piece, but American golden plovers are not often seen during spring migration, especially in Rhode Island. On the East Coast, a lot of them migrate across the middle of the country to their breeding grounds, and then they make a clockwise turn in migration and come down through in the fall. So when these adults leave the breeding ground, their plumage starts to wear, and these features become, the features like the undertail coverts become less reliable because that black belly on the black-bellied and the black belly and black undertail on the American golden fade away when they get to non-breeding plumage. And the real challenge is adult and basic plumage and juveniles. So in terms of Pluvialis plovers, black-bellied versus American golden plover, you have juvenile black-bellied here. It's a gray bird, might be flecked with some golds. The fresh juveniles can be really, really bright. So you can't really rely on the golden plumage of the golden plover, but they still have a big head, a thick neck, hefty bill, and shorter primaries, which gives them kind of that chunky overall appearance. Our juvenile or basic American golden plover, again, is a leaner bird. It's got a smaller head, a thinner bill. It's got a bigger eye on that small head that kind of stands out. And it's got a thinner neck and much longer wings. Another point to look at, the American golden plover in this plumage has a clearly dark head that's separated by a very bright white eyebrow or supercilium. You can see there's a dull eyebrow on the black-bellied plover on the left, but the head kind of blends in with everything else. It doesn't really contrast against that supercilium. Susan, my wife, and I found an American golden plover this fall here in Pennsylvania in our county here. And the thing was 100 yards away. And in the spotting scope, the first thing you pick out is that dark head and that bright white supercilium. So that is a good piece to look at. Another thing that's a little more subtle, but is present, if you look at the bellies of the birds, the adults have the black belly or white undertail and the black belly and black undertail. Black-bellied plovers have a clean white belly with streaked flanks and a streaked breast. The American golden plover has a grayish kind of washed belly that's got streaking and it sort of looks dirtier underneath. Again, that's kind of tougher to judge, but it is present. And if you got the two standing right next to each other, it's pretty easy to see as well. All right. Any questions about American golden versus black-bellied plover?
This one comes from Sue Dunn. Where are American golden plovers usually seen in fall migration here in Rhode Island? Are they more at the shore, or would you be more apt to see them in the fields?
Well, that's a great question. So this one that I photographed on Race Point Beach and on Cape Cod out in Provincetown was on the beach. This photographed individual from Sue Palmer was photographed on the beach at Napatree. But the best place to see American golden plover in Rhode Island is actually in upland dry habitats, specifically turf fields. This is a bird that likes big open grassland, grassy habitats, especially during migration. So in central Rhode Island, West Kingston, the area around URI, Richmond, and even up into southern Exeter, those turf field systems. So I think it's Tuckahoe Turf, Kingston Turf Farm, and I forget the name of the other one that's over towards Switch Road. There's a couple over there as well. Those are your places where you're going to find American golden plover and a couple other species that we're going to talk about here in the coming minutes as well. So turf fields, good spot for American golden plover. Black-bellied's more likely to be found on the coast, but again, American golden plover can be found in coastal habitats as well, and black-bellied plover are occasionally found on turf fields. So habitat is a good clue, but it should not be your end-all in terms of identification.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Sue, for the question. Nothing else in the chat. So if anybody else has something else about the two species, go ahead and raise your hand, or Matt, you may begin your next part.
All right, we'll move through, and if any other questions come up, we can always go back as well. All right, so now we're going to talk about small sandpipers, aka the Peeps. Peeps is a collective term for a group of several different small sandpipers. I think typically we're talking about least, semi-palmated, western, white-rumped, Bairds, and occasionally Pectoral Sandpiper, Dunlin, and Sanderling are thrown in there as well, but we're going to leave those ones out for time's sake and because they're a little easier to identify than some of the other Peeps. So these are small species. Generally speaking, they're not all very similar to each other, other than the fact that they're smaller sandpipers, but several groups of species within the Peep group are very similar to each other individually. So we'll start off with the easiest one to identify, least sandpiper. This is a fresh juvenile least sandpiper from Charlestown, Rhode Island. This is a late July, early August migrant. I remember this one because it's one of the first waves of fresh juveniles that we saw that year. And least sandpipers are really easy to identify because they're the only small Peep that has yellow legs. Pectoral sandpiper, which essentially looks like a gigantic least, also has yellow legs, but they're easily 2 times as big as least. So they're a little easier to break out identification-wise. The other thing that's kind of separates least sandpiper from the other very small Peeps, mainly western and semi-palmated sandpipers, is their plumage. The fresh juveniles have a lot of rusty and rufous features like this one, but the adults are more chocolatey brown, whereas the adult semi-palmated and westerns, the dominant base color is more gray, especially in non-breeding plumage. So in that basic plumage, least stand out as being more of a chocolatey brown. That's actually how I was taught to identify them in winter in the Southeast, was to look for the brown ones. Those will be your least more than likely. And then your westerns are going to be more gray in plumage. So another thing about least sandpipers, they are like always crouching for some reason. That posture is really distinctive and they almost never get out of it. So much so that when they stand straight up, even with the yellow legs, they confuse me. So they're almost always doing this, which is like crouching down. And even when they're feeding or walking, their legs are almost always bent, and it's almost like they're just ready to lay down on the ground. And that can be really distinctive as well, because there are other smaller Peeps, the semi-palmated western that we're going to talk about in a minute. They don't really do this. They stand more straight up. And especially for western, they actually tip over to feed. They don't crouch and pick things right in front of them. This is another fresh juvenile least sandpiper. I actually photographed this one this summer in Pennsylvania. This is on a creek bed. All right. So now we'll get into more of the tougher, small Peeps. So we have semi-palmated sandpipers. These are, along with least, this is probably the most common species, a small sandpiper that you're going to see in Rhode Island. This one is a worn adult. You can kind of see the ratty looking disorganized plumage across the top of the back. There's some leftover alternate plumage with the rufous and black feathers, and there's some gray feathers coming in over top of that, which represents the basic plumage that this bird is molting into. So small peep, gray overall base plumage for adults as they molt out of and away from that alternate plumage. The main thing with semi-palmated sandpipers is that they have a shorter, even thickness of their bill. So they have a shorter bill that's not super tapered, and it's pretty straight on most individuals. Another thing about semi-palmated sandpipers is the name implies their feet are actually partially webbed, and that's why I picked this photo. I want you to ignore the color on the plumage of this photo because it's really washed out and the light actually alters it. This one looks very brown, but they typically don't look that brown. You have the webbing of the toes is what I want you to see here. That can be really useful in helping to eliminate other peeps, but not the one that looks the most similar to them, unfortunately. And the species that looks the most similar to semi-palmated sandpiper is Western sandpiper. And this individual Western sandpiper is a fresh juvenile. So it's really popping. It's got a lot of rufous in the plumage, just like the least sandpiper. But you'll notice that it's got black legs. Its legs are kind of long. And unlike the semi-palmated, it has a long decurved bill that kind of kinks at the tip, and it's got a fine tip to the bill. So it's kind of tapered down to a finer tip, and it's decurved. And some other things to look at on this bird, Western sandpipers have big blocky heads. So compared to semi-palmateds, which have relatively small heads, almost like I think of them as like a little ping pong ball on their body, Western sandpipers have this big blocky head. It's almost like a Lego brick. And then they have longer necks and thicker necks that support that larger head. So this picture is a really good photo to show that. It's another juvenile, fresh juvenile Western sandpiper. You can see the long bill that they're really known for. That's what a lot of folks look to. But you can also see that big blocky head. It's more square or rectangular like a Lego brick. And you can also see the detail in the feet. They also have partially webbed feet. Another thing I'll mention is you'll see the orange feathering on the back. Those are the scapulars in the adult Western sandpipers, or the juvenile Western sandpipers, and some of the fresh juveniles. This is a feature that a lot of folks point out. They've got really bright, fiery scapulars on the back, and it can be helpful. A bird like this really stands out, or a really fresh juvenile like this one, where there's a lot of rufous going on. But juvenile semi-palmated sandpipers also have rusty feathers across their back. So I'll show you the comparison here. They're not nearly as bright, but they're concentrated in the same area. So it could be really easy to convince yourself that you're seeing those rusty scapulars on this juvenile semi-palmated sandpiper on the right versus the real rusty scapulars of the juvenile Western on the left. But if you look at the features and ignore size, these two are actually pretty close together in size, but the bird on the right was closer to me when I photographed it. You can look at the small rounded head of the semi-palmated versus the bigger blockier head of the Western. You can see the slightly longer legs of the Western, but really you can see that long bill that kinks down at the end and gets thinner at the end versus the thicker, shorter, straight bill of the semi-palmated sandpiper on the right. All right, so we'll move on to larger peeps. So they're still small sandpipers, but they are going to be big enough that they're going to stand out in a flock of semi-palmateds. These two species are going to be much bigger, noticeably larger. So we'll start with the most common. This is a white rump sandpiper. White rump sandpipers start showing up during spring migration, fairly common from spring migration through November into fall migration. This one here is a worn adult. It's molting out of its adult plumage. You can see some flecks of streaking on the flanks. That's left over from them being from the adult plumage. And then you can see kind of a cold gray across the top of the head and the back, and the white supercilium. That's the remnants of the basic plumage, which is coming in. And the thing to note about the large peeps, the two species that we're going to talk about, they're both long-winged. So if you look at the back of this bird, you'll see that the wings extend well beyond the tail. And that's very helpful in identifying them. If they're alone, you know, size can be hard to judge. You see those wings sticking out well past the tail, you've got either a white-rumped or a barred sandpiper on your hands. Semi-palmated, western, and least sandpipers, their wings only extend to the tail and sometimes not even that far. So these are what we call the long-winged peeps, white-rumped. And then in breeding plumage, because we see white-rumped sandpipers during spring migration, adults that are migrating to breeding grounds, they're much brighter. They don't have that cold gray plumage or that worn plumage that we see later in the year. They've got rufous speckled throughout, really crisp, nice streaking that extends into the flanks and almost back to the vent. But you can still see the wings are still long. And one thing to note is that in breeding plumage and sometimes in the worn plumage, and if you're close enough in other plumages, you can see that they have a red base to the bill, especially the lower bill. And that's distinctive for a black-legged peep. The only other sandpiper, smaller sandpiper, that has that red base to the bill is a pectoral sandpiper, which has yellow legs. So you've got this white-rumped. If you can see the red base of the bill, that's a clutch feature, but that's kind of tough to tell. So you really want to look for the wings, the long wings that go well beyond the tail. That's your push towards white-rumped. The only other species that we see that has those long wings is actually, oh, we'll get to beards in a second, but I want to showcase all the different plumages of white-rumped. This is a non-breeding white-rumped sandpiper, so a basic plumage bird. This is actually a juvenile that's just about to finish molting into non-breeding plumage. Basic plumage, you can see that fine scaly plumage on the side of the wings, some remnants of flecked rufous through the back, which is about to disappear, and this bird's going to be basically just like an adult in basic plumage in just a couple of days. This one was photographed in, I think it was in November. This is Moonstone Beach. But you can see the longer wings. The supercilium, the white eyebrow, is really important for white-rumped sandpiper. It really stands out across the cold gray rest of the plumage, coupled with the long wings, that's distinctive. But most importantly, no matter what plumage white-rumped sandpiper is in, the name tells you all you need to know. And this is, again, why I say, do not look away when birds start flying, because the white-rumped is there no matter what plumage they're in. And you're not going to see it on a bird that's standing because the wings extend beyond and cover it up. So unless they're moving their wings or flying, it's a hard field mark to view. But when they're in flight, it's very easy. None of our other sandpipers that you're going to see are going to have this bright white rump. And these are actually the two birds that I photographed the two slides beforehand. So they're the same individuals, just showing you wouldn't have seen the white rump unless they flew. That's particularly important because there is one other species of long-winged peep. The wings don't eliminate all species. We also have barred sandpiper. This is not nearly as common as white-rumped. They're regular migrants in Rhode Island. You typically see a handful of them show up each year, particularly a little later in fall migration, so into September, late August is when we start to see them. What's really important is that barred sandpipers during spring migration migrate across the middle of the country, just like American golden plovers. So we don't see barred sandpipers until the fall. And the ones we see in the fall are pretty much all juveniles, fresh juveniles. And that's really helpful because fresh juvenile barred sandpipers have a buffy hood. So they have a buffy chest and a buffy head, and they've got really fine scaly plumage across their back, which can help identify them. So this species is not coming through in the spring. You're not going to see adults, or even you're probably not going to see adults in warm plumage even in fall, because most of the species coming through are juveniles. I think I checked eBird like 2 years ago. I think there was like 2 records, spring records of adult barred sandpipers across all of New England. So it's a very uncommon species in spring, but regular in fall. So one thing about, and I do want to thank Patrick Felker for this picture. This is a really good picture of a barred sandpiper. And I know a lot of folks are probably looking at this just amazed because it's better than any I've taken as well. But when this species is in flight, the long wings stand out. You can see the scaly back, and you'll notice that it's bigger than the semi-palmated sandpiper that's out of focus behind it. But when you see that long-winged appearance, you can instantly say like, oh, Baird's or white rumps. And if you look at the rump, it's not white. It's white on the edges, but it's black down the middle, and it doesn't have that big white rump patch that a white rump sandpiper would have. So if you're familiar with Northern Harrier and their white rump, so white rump sandpipers are like the Northern Harrier of the shorebird world. They've got that white rump, and it's really definitive when you see a bird in flight. Also, the next slide that I have, I want to go back to Patrick's photo. Again, this is like, if you're looking at a Baird sandpiper like this, you're having a very good day. Even if you're looking at one like this, you're having a pretty good day. This is much more typical of what you're going to see from a Baird sandpiper. This is a species that likes open, dry habitats, particularly turf fields. And so you're much more likely to have a Baird sandpiper in your spotting scope that's 200 yards away that you're trying to pick out than a really nice bird on a mud flat like the one that Patrick had photographed. And the same field marks apply though. You can see the bird has a buffy or golden hood. You can even almost make out the scaly back feathers in my terrible photos of this bird. And the long tapered look of the bird is really distinctive. White rump sandpiper is the only thing that's going to look like that. And they're typically not on turf fields. Usually Bairds are all alone out there. The other birds in this photograph, just to give you kind of a size comparison, there's a pectoral sandpiper in the back. And I'm pretty sure the birds in the front are either least or well, I'm positive they're either least or semi-palmated. But I can't remember exactly which one they were. They're kind of crouching like least, but it might be semi-palmated. I'm not sure. But again, expectation versus reality, you know, expectation, this is what reality was Baird sandpiper. So any questions about Peeps?
Matt, there's no questions in the chat, but obviously some nice compliments on the photography for sure. And then you answered the question all about the feet of the palmated and how it got its name. So you answered the question already. So great job. We're running just over an hour at this point. We have lost some folks. I know you're going to be wrapping up soon. So
sure.
You guys can just stay with us here. No problem.
Yeah, I've just got a couple more slides about location here, and we'll move right along through, okay? Oh, I do need to talk about dowitchers still. Forgot about that. So this is the most complex group to identify of all of the shorebird identification issues that you can run into. You know, across North America. I actually was just looking at an identification thread on Facebook. Somebody this is short-billed versus long-billed dowitcher. Somebody mentioned, if you're trying to identify dowitchers by bill length, you've already lost. So this is a very challenging group for a variety of reasons. I'm going to hopefully make them a little bit simpler for you. And if you're really thinking about trying to find long-billed dowitcher, hopefully I'm going to put your mind at ease because there's some things about timing and plumages that are really helpful. So this one here is a short-billed dowitcher photographed by Nick Caselli. Thank him for photographs. So short-billed dowitcher, far and away the more common of the two species you're going to find in Rhode Island. Long-billed dowitcher, much less common. Typically positively identified in a year, you might get 2 or 3 long-billed dowitchers versus you might be able to find 50 to 100 short-billed dowitchers in one location during peak migration time. So short-billed dowitcher, much more common and occurs over a much longer period of time, typically speaking. There are some primary challenges to this identification puzzle. This is a juvenile short-billed dowitcher photographed by Sue Palmer. One primary challenge is that a lot of the focus, if you're looking at online ID groups, sometimes even field guides, as we'll see in a little bit, is directed to field marks that I personally find less than reliable in terms of separating the two species, especially since typically long-billed dowitchers, you're trying to identify a lone single bird, not one that you're comparing with the short-billed dowitcher standing right next to it, which makes it even more difficult. And then another big challenge is that there are multiple subspecies of short-billed dowitcher, and we're going to look at what kind of problems that presents as well. So we'll start with alternate adults or fresh breeding plumage adults. Typically, the more common subspecies of short-billed dowitcher on the East Coast of North America is the Atlantic species. That's the one on the top. It's got an orange neck, orange throat. It's heavily spotted across the throat, but it's got a white belly and white undertail coverts. Your long-billed dowitcher in alternate plumage as an adult is below. And it's seemingly a pretty simple ID because they have orange bellies, and the orange goes all the way down through almost the undertail coverts. So like your black-bellied and American golden plover, that there's an easy ID distinction there. But there are two subspecies of short-billed dowitchers that occur in Rhode Island. And the prairie short-billed dowitcher, it's listed as central here, but it's Hendersonian or prairie, actually also has an orange belly and orange undertail coverts. So it can be pretty difficult to identify from a long-billed dowitcher. You'll note that on the sides of the neck on the prairie short-billed dowitcher, it's very sparsely spotted and pretty clean versus the dark bars on an adult long-billed dowitcher. One thing that's helpful here is that typically we see prairie short-billed dowitchers early on in that fall migration period. So usually we see adults that are coming through, identifiable adults that are coming through in July. And we don't typically start seeing long-billed dowitchers until much later. So we do find the Hendersonian or prairie short-billed dowitcher species in Rhode Island. I photographed this one on Napatree Point in early July a couple of years ago. There's a group of 4 dowitchers, all short-bills, 2 prairie, 2 Atlantic short-billed dowitchers. So this subspecies does occur regularly in Rhode Island. There's not that many birders that are going to pick out that subspecies, but there are several photos from a lot of different birders over the years on eBird. So it's a species, it's a subspecies that's there and should be considered. The really difficult part of identifying dowitchers is in basic plumage. So when they've lost all their breeding plumage and they're in that non-breeding winter basic plumage, they're both gray, they both have white bellies, they're very difficult to tell apart. And there's a couple of things that we can look at here that I'll try to highlight in a little bit. One is that long-billed dowitcher has a dark tail, so the tail is striped. The black stripes are wider than the white stripes. On a short-billed dowitcher, the white stripes are wider than the black stripes. And one thing that's really hammered on by a lot of folks in dowitcher ID is the shape of the bird. And you'll see it's mentioned here. This is from the Sibley app. Short-billed dowitchers forage with a flat back, and long-billed dowitchers forage with a more rounded back. I've heard folks say that long-billed dowitchers look like they swallowed a grapefruit. I would warn you to be very careful about this field mark. Number one, they don't stand still when they're foraging, so it's very difficult to gauge. And number two, I've seen so many really chunky short-billed dowitchers, and Dan Berard can attest to this. I don't know how many Digiscope photos I've sent him of short-billed dowitchers that were just basically fat. They weren't long-billed. This can be a tough field mark to judge. If it's there, you might see it and you might utilize that to help you make an ID, but it shouldn't be the only thing that you look at. But timing can be very helpful. Short-billed dowitchers, the adults start migrating very early. We see them through June, and they're almost all gone by the time September reaches Rhode Island. You'll see this plumage start showing up in September. I looked at my own eBird records for 6 years of birding in Rhode Island, and I focused on shorebirds. I had over 130 checklists with short-billed dowitchers. Only 11 of them occurred later than September 1st. And none of the individual dowitchers on those 11 checklists were adults in basic plumage. They were all fresh juveniles. So an adult in basic plumage short-billed dowitcher after September is a much rarer bird than an adult that's molting into basic plumage earlier in the summer. Consequently, long-billed dowitcher shows up much later. They're a species that can be migrating through Rhode Island. There's records in December and January. So if you see a dowitcher in Rhode Island in October or November that looks like this, there's a pretty good chance that it's a long-billed. Not saying that it's guaranteed, there's always stragglers, there's always possibilities, but the data implies that long-billed dowitchers are coming through much later. And so this plumage, this adult basic plumage, is typically only seen on long-billed dowitchers in Rhode Island. And on this one, you can kind of see the tail. You can see the thick black bands and the thin white bands, just to kind of give you an idea of what it looks like in flight. This is from the Sibley app. Short-billed dowitcher on top, long-billed dowitcher on the bottom. So that can be used to kind of confirm that identification. All right, now there's a much easier solution to identifying dowitchers, and that's fresh juveniles. Fresh juveniles are so much easier to tell apart. So this is a long-billed dowitcher on the left and a short-billed dowitcher on the right. It's a photo from last September. It's a photo from Luis Ruggieri, who, by the way, huge shout out to Luis, who found two separate long-billed dowitchers. She found this one and she found this one in 2 consecutive years in Newport County. I looked all over Rhode Island for long-billed dowitchers and only found one in 6 years. So huge props to Luis for finding both of these birds. But they're very easy to tell apart in this plumage because if you look at the wings of the birds, what's called the tertial feathers. So towards the back of the bird, over the tail, on the rightmost bird, the short-billed dowitcher, you'll notice what they call the tiger stripes. It's got bright rufous edging and streaks all through the feather. If you look at the same feathers on the long-billed dowitcher in the back, you'll see that they're plain. They don't have that. So when you see a juvenile dowitcher, it's got these buffy sides, it's not really spotted or heavily marked like our adults. You see plain tertial feathers off the back of the wings, that's going to be a long-billed dowitcher. And if you see them standing right next to each other, they're exceptionally easy to tell apart. So that September timeframe, when you're seeing a lot of fresh juvenile short-billed dowitchers, if you're looking for a long-billed, look at those juvenile dowitchers and look at those wing feathers, those tertial feathers, and that will tell you all you need to know, because a long-billed like this should bounce right out for you. All right, this is a Atlantic short-billed dowitcher on the right and a prairie Hendersonian on the left. Any questions about dowitchers? That's not a comprehensive identification of dowitchers, just kind of a quick tutorial.
Matt, there was one about from Catherine. How long does the plumage transition take and when does it take place?
That's a great question. I'm not sure exactly how long, but both of these short-billed dowitchers are in what we call worn plumage. This is July. So the bird on the right, you can see, is already losing some of that really ornate plumage across the back and replacing it with those brown feathers. So by September, an adult short-billed dowitcher should be in basic plumage. Same with an adult long-billed dowitcher, but they'll start molting as they migrate. So it could take, actually, I'm not even going to say, because I don't know exactly how long it could take, or how long it typically takes.
There were no other questions in the chat, Matt. Maybe if anybody else has questions on dowitchers or any of the other species covered tonight, feel free to unmute or raise your hand or add to the chat.
Sure. All right. I will kind of move on to our next, talk quickly about resources for ID. I know I've thrown out a lot of information and I've probably talked in circles. So following up with this, if you're looking for a resource for Shorebird ID, I highly recommend the Shorebird Guide by Michael O'Brien, Richard Crossley, and Kevin Carlson. This is an extremely comprehensive book that goes over molt timing, patterns, and migration timing of basically every species found in North America and several species found in Europe. So very good book, great reference photos, pages and pages. And this is solely book based on identification of shorebirds. If you're looking for online resources, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, it's the Macaulay Library. That's what I used for those vocalizations on the yellowlegs. That's where you find the eBirds audio recordings and eBird photos. If you're familiar with eBird, if you don't want to use the Macaulay Library, you can also check out Cornell Lab of Ornithology's Birds of the World. This is a subscription service. If you want more information than you could possibly ever digest about pretty much every bird on the planet, then go ahead and subscribe to Birds of the World. I used Birds of the World for a lot of the information on this presentation for as a reference material. I have an account. It's very useful for odd questions like how long does the molt timing take for short-billed dowitchers, Catherine? Birds of the World has all of that information in there. So, and it's all online, web sourced. So if you have too many birding books, which nobody does, and you don't want to buy another one, Birds of the World is a good option. All right, we'll move on quickly to finding shorebirds. So just start off quickly by talking about the types of habitats that they inhabit. Shorebirds feed on invertebrates and wet substrate. This means mud or sand. So they rely on habitats that are typically near water. And most of them rely on habitats that have recently been underwater. So the most reliable habitats for shorebirds are coastal. You have sandy or rocky beaches, salt marshes, parking lot puddles, places that at one point in time may have been good for boating, like this boat here. But when you're looking, you generally want the water to be mostly gone, and you want wet mud for the birds to be foraging on. If you don't want to go to the beach or near the beach in the summer, I can't blame you. You can look for shorebirds at inland locations as well, especially along muddy margins of ponds, lakes, and rivers. Last summer, I know it was very dry here in Pennsylvania, and I think it was dry in Rhode Island as well. Places like Johnson's Pond and Coventry, the Cumberland Reservoir, some of the bigger rivers like Big River, where the level drops off in dry years. Those muddy banks are great spots to find shorebirds. And often there aren't a whole lot of birders looking for shorebirds there. So you may find something that people didn't even know about. And then finally, upland or dry habitats. The best one in Rhode Island is turf fields. In the central part of the state, there's several turf fields. And those grassy turf fields attract a lot of insects. That species like buff-breasted, Baird's, Sandpiper, and Pectoral Sandpiper, as well as American golden plover, will really flock to. Heaton Orchard Road is where I saw my lifer American golden plover in Richmond. I've also seen them Tuckahoe Turf Farm, further west in Richmond. So those turf fields are also good spots. So if you're ever driving through the turf fields on your way to the beach and you notice birders with a scope, you know what they're looking for now. So some specific habitats and specific really famous shorebirding locations. I just want to go over quick about access and where to look for the birds and some considerations. So the first one I want to talk about is Napatree Point. Napatree Point Conservation Area is, I want to say, world famous shorebird location, definitely famous in the US after Jan found the Pteryx sandpiper there last year. So Napatree Point is Rhode Island's most southwesterly point. So it's right off of Watch Hill. It's basically a sandy spit, big dune. The parking there is noted on the red and the right. It's in Watch Hill. It's on the street. We'll circle back to that. You've got a long walk, upwards of a half mile across the beach on the bay side into the lagoon area, which is marked by the first green line right above where it says Napatree Point Conservation Area. And that whole lagoon and mudflat area all the way around the front of the point is a really great spot for shorebirding during spring migration all the way through August and September. The lagoon area specifically is where a lot of birders spend their time. And that makes sense because time is really critical at this site. You want to hit this site at low tide, but you have to also consider the access point. So Watch Hill is very stingy about parking. Street parking on Watch Hill is 2 hours maximum, and they will ticket you at 2 hours and 1 second. So you need to be able to maximize your time out to the end and back. And also that parking can be very difficult to secure, even just to get those 2 hours. So my technique for doing Napatree was to look for days where the low tide correlated right around the sunrise time. I'd show up and park on the street at about 4:30 in the morning. And they don't start counting the timing on the parking until later in the morning. I think it's 8 or 9 a.m. So that gives you all the time in the world to go out there. And I know some of you are sitting up in Burrowville or Providence going, I'm not waking up at 2 o'clock in the morning to go to Napatree. That's fine. Just consider the fact that you may not want to plan your day around going to Napatree Point in the middle of the day because it can be near impossible to find a parking spot. So that's Napatree Point. The next very famous birding site in Rhode Island is the Vinaigrette Pond Mudflats, also sometimes referred to as Charlestown Breachway. This is the area of Vinaigrette Pond directly behind the actual Charlestown Breachway and Charlestown Beach. The parking is at Charlestown Beach, represented by the red block. You've got to walk all the way to the back of the campground, go in along the boat launch, and then follow the coastline all the way across, and you'll notice that there is no dry passage to get to the areas in green where the birds are. So you must plan to get wet at this location unless you have a kayak or a canoe or some other boat. You're going to have to wade across the canal just down from where it says Rhode Island. It is, typically speaking, on me about belly button depth at high tide, a little lower than that at low tide. This location is good whether it's low tide or high tide. You're going to find birds there. Low tide, more birds foraging. High tide, more birds roosting. But the big consideration here is that parking is limited at Charlestown State Beach. You got to pay for it after 8 or 8:30, depending on the day. And if it's a really nice day on a weekend, you can expect that the lot's going to be full by 9:30, 10 o'clock in the morning. So these are morning locations that you're going to want to get to early to avoid most of the people. I realize this information is probably a little bit different the way things are with the pandemic. But in terms of when the pandemic ends and accessing these sites, the access for parking is the biggest limiting factor for a lot of folks. So good site to hit in the morning. Tide is not as important as it is at Napatree. High tide at Napatree can mean a lot less birds than you see at low tide. Here, you're still going to see a lot of birds at low tide. In the best days here at the Charlestown Breachway, you can see 10,000 individual shorebirds, and they will literally run between your legs. So most of the photos from this PowerPoint were taken there. It's a great place to get up close views. And if you're like me and love swimming, you can go swimming and look at shorebirds. So it's a really great spot. The next spot I'll talk about is Succotash Marsh. This is technically Succotash Marsh Wildlife Management Area, which is managed by DEM. It's a big salt marsh behind East Matunic State Beach. There's a couple of very limited parking options here. One is right along the side of the road, right before you get to the beach parking lot. And the other is a little pull off back towards Captain Jack's Seafood and Matunic Oyster Bar. The main flats that folks bird here are alongside the road at those locations. The section right beside the red marked parking area closer to the beach, the section on the left, is often referred to as the sweet spot. That usually congregates most of the shorebirds there, especially at lower tide levels and sometimes at higher tide. The location just north of North Point Lane is also very good. That's usually the two spots that I check really quickly when I'm going into Succotash. Again, State Beach parking lot right there. Very busy area, usually has police directing traffic who may or may not let you pull off the side of the road with your four ways on to look at the birds. So just keep in mind, midday, hot sunny day, no pandemic, might not be the best place to hedge your bets. You might want to try somewhere else. Moving over into Newport County and away from South County, this is one of my personal favorites, Breton Point State Park. This is definitely what I call a blue collar shorebirding spot. You don't have to walk very far. You can get in and out. The locations where the birds are very close to the parking. So this is on Ocean Drive in Newport. This is the southwestern most point of Aquidneck Island. As you're going around, the parking literally wraps the whole way around the point. You get out, you walk right to the seawall. There'll be birds right in front of you. The best place to bird this location is on the west side, right where it says Kit's Kites Toy Store. That green area south of there is where the break wall comes out. There's a jetty, and it actually funnels rackweed in there on the tide. So there's these big mats of rackweed that build up there, and that's where the shorebirds feed. And they're just a couple of feet away from you. Typically don't pay attention to people very much. It's a really nice spot. I'd love to go in there, but I could go there before work, which was really great on weekdays. So Breton Point State Park, another Aquidneck Island, Newport County site, Satchwest Salt Marsh. The area circled in red is the third beach public parking lot. That's a town beach lot. You got to pay to get in there after 9 a.m. But it's a very good shorebird spot. This is another regular site for me. When I lived in Rhode Island, I worked right down through Beach Road. So I could come here in the morning before they charged, sit in the corner of the parking lot, and watch those mud flats. Also out on Third Beach, the little stretch of green on the beach. That's the area inside Succotash Point National Wildlife Refuge. There's not supposed to be any dogs over there, which makes it the best spot on the beach to actually find shorebirds typically. And then one last site specific to Rhode Island that I'll talk about is Quicksand Pond. This is a site that I haven't buried as extensively as the others, but I do know about the access. Basically have another public beach parking lot town. This is Low Compton Town Beach. It's called South Shore Beach. And you park there, walk all the way out to the channel and then back in to the mud flats. One thing about this location is the Nature Conservancy of Rhode Island manages this site, and they do have an extensive network of protected breeding shorebird habitat for piping plovers, least terns, and other species. So the access is a little bit restricted around that. You need to make sure when you're accessing there that you're not trudging through areas that are roped off for nesting birds and not disturbing nesting birds. If you go later in the year, typically in September through November, it's not as big of a deal, which also crowds are less of a deal after September as well. Midsummer, this can be a tough spot to access just based on parking like any of the other ones. All right, any other questions?
Matt, there's no other questions in the chat, but there was obviously some good connections to the book you mentioned, and then also Lauren Parmalee mentioned that Third Beach parking lot is supposed to let you in if you are birding the federal property.
I can confirm that I have gotten my way into that parking lot before, but I thought I was just getting special treatment because I was there all the time. So that's good to know. Thank you, Lauren. I really appreciate that. So that's good to know. You know, the folks that run the parking lot at Third Beach are usually really reasonable. So if you tell them you're birding the marsh, they'll more than likely let you in regardless.
Matt, you did an excellent job. I encourage you to read through the chat with a lot of compliments for your presentation and your expertise in these areas of Rhode Island and sharing your knowledge of what you know. Really, really appreciate it. If you don't mind unsharing your screen, we can all unmute our cameras if we want. We can, you can say hello to some friends you haven't seen in a while, or people can hang out and just ask some questions. So feel free to unmute when you guys are ready.
There we go. I went a little bit over my hour time frame. I knew that was going to be ambitious.
No, there's a lot to talk about, right? I mean, you think about shorebirds, what a complicated, subject to really dive into. And I'm so
come and visit us, Matt.
I was actually in Rhode Island for a very hot minute back in January. But I did some shorebirding. You better believe that I picked up I went purple sandpiper immediately as soon as I got to Rhode Island. That was like a very difficult species here. So I was hanging out. I saw Mark Kaigarini, and I was like, you know what? We need to get purple sandpipers.
Great. It's great to see you. We miss you.
I know, Matt. I miss you too. And I'm like, well, could we run an Audubon trip to Pennsylvania?
Pennsylvania Wilds Warbler Weekend.
Ooh, like that's what I'm thinking. Like, how can we capitalize on the fact you're in a different state?
I will say that Susan and I were informed on several occasions by a friend of ours here that McKean County, where we live in Pennsylvania, has the highest number of breeding warbler species of any county in the state.
Wow.
So we're pretty excited about that.
Awesome. And things are going well in Pennsylvania. You have a job.
I do. Technically, I have a job. I'm not working right now. I go back to work in just over a week. So,
okay.
But I've been off for the winter, so my job has been pretty much hardcore birding. The finch eruption and cross-country skiing season. I've been cross-country skiing a lot and birding, so it's been great. But I'm looking forward to going back to work. I work in uniform now. So I used to work in a t-shirt at the bird sanctuary. Now I work in a fancy uniform with patches. People think I'm a police officer.
You don't have to decide what to wear in the morning.
That's a good point, yeah. And I don't have to do laundry all that much.
I used to really hate uniforms for a long time, and then I'm like, well, now I just wear what I have to wear and I don't have to think about it.
Yeah, That's not too bad. I do say, you know, winters in Rhode Island are very mild, especially compared to here. We've been getting pummeled all winter. Like we've had two or three 40-degree days in the last 2 weeks. And each time I'm like, yes, this is like yesterday it was very nice. And then today they went down to like the single digits last night. And I was like, nope, not yet. It's so cold.
How's Susan doing?
She's doing well. She's over in the kitchen right now. Do you want to come out, Susan? She just ate a piece of pizza, so she'll be over in a second. But we started a blog / nature art company.
Hi, Jana. Oh, hey, everybody.
Susan, hi.
Susan.
Oh, long hair, long hair.
Yeah, I get my haircut, my work haircut.
Long hair,
Nice.
beard, yeah.
I've been avoiding the barber. But we have a new blog / nature art company, Northern Tier Naturalists, with the website northerntiernaturalists.com. It's going to be our winter project, which Susan has some fresh sticker art on. So if you're interested in eruptive winter finch stickers, we've
I'm
got
interested.
fine grosbeaks, evening grosbeaks, crossbills. Those are all on the Etsy shop. If you go to northerntiernaturalists.com, you can get to the Etsy from there, or you can go to Etsy and I think it's North Tier Naturalists.
Yes, just however, since I have a very basic shop setup, depending on what search terms you use, I may or may not come up because I don't pay a lot for advertising right now. So
What's the site again?
can we put it in the chat so people have it, or that
Yeah,
not be okay?
Yes, if we can.
Oh, that's good.
See if I can.
Northern Tier, right? Northern Tier Naturalist.
Northern
Northern Tier
Tier.
Naturalists.
We're in the Northern Tier. It's Northern
Yeah,
Tier
you're right.
Naturalists, and then I'll put the actual site.
I was going to ask you about your finch, what's going on in Pennsylvania with finches.
Oh, they're
Yeah,
going on.
there's a lot.
Oh my God, that's awesome.
Oh, that's
Did you
about-
get a
Yeah.
lot of pine gross?
We did not get a lot of pine grosbeaks. They did not make their way south. This far south, we got a lot of evening grosbeaks and a lot of red pulls.
Yeah, we did too. We even had hoary.
Nice. Yeah, we have had a couple of, yes,
Yes, you did.
we've had a couple of hories in Pennsylvania. Susan and I were actually part of the finder team that found the first hoary in Pennsylvania in over 6 years. So way
Wow.
back in November, first
Awesome.
group of red pulls we
Pennsylvania
found.
needs you.
Well,
That's
it was the first group of red pulls we found. You know, it was just like November 5th or something, and there was like 5 red pulls, and one of them was a hoary. And I was like, holy crap! And it was later on we realized that Pennsylvania hadn't had one in 6
Did you
winters.
say hoary crap?
Hoary red pulls.
Hoary
Oh, look at
crap.
that varied thrush. That's a great
Oh, look at
background,
that,
Sue.
Sue.
We
And,
don't have any varied thrush.
I don't know. I have no idea if all of them here because they're all.
Oh yeah, there's a lot.
we have to thank Sue for stepping in and doing the osprey just while I have you right there. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'm glad. Not up to a whole lot these days, so glad I could help out, and it was kind of fun. It's like, oh, I know what this is. It's good to work on a project when you know how it's supposed to go.
Yeah.
And it's beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
We miss you. Both of
Miss you guys too.
We do indeed.
I want to mention
Talking to
too that-
Rachel today. I was talking to Rachel today.
yeah.
I told her you were doing this talk, and she was excited to hear you were
Well, that's
connected
why she
to Rhode
texted me.
Island.
She texted me today.
Good.
I did put the website in. I put it in wrong the first time. So it's northerntiernaturalists.com, not northerntiernaturalist.
Okay.
There's a couple of blog posts on there. Actually, if you're interested in what's going on with the finch eruption, I have a write-up in there. But basically around here, lots of evening grosbeaks and lots of red pulls. And earlier there were a lot of pine siskin and purple finches, but they've kind of gone. I just saw my first purple finches in several months the other day, but we're still getting evening grosbeaks just randomly all over the place, which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
Some nice pictures. I'm looking at it.
Oh, nice.
Nice. So Matt, I don't know if you know Devin, who is on the call.
Yeah, is it
Janine Silver's
Janine? Oh,
son.
nice. Awesome.
Right, and I got him hooked into birding last spring.
Excellent. I think I noticed that he
He's a
was
better birder than I am.
nice.
So he's 13 last weekend.
Wow.
Got a camera and a lens because he's bar mitzvah. And when he says something like the lesser yellow legs fly, da, 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 he knows so much. And he's going to go to Israel at some point, and he's
Yeah.
already studied the whole Israel bird book. And I'm Janine's so sad that you and Susan aren't here to run the Young Birders Club, because Devin would be like,
Yeah.
Amanda,
Yeah, we Vito and Amanda, who had done some young birder walks with us, they are still doing stuff, probably not because of the pandemic right now, obviously,
Right.
but I'll make sure we'll touch base with Amanda and just make
yeah,
sure
I know,
to connect them, because I have Janine's contact info. So.
oh yeah, you know how awesome she is. And her husband drive Devin around, just like Patrick's parents used to drive him around everywhere.
Nice.
Oh my God, it's just like it's just a wonderful, wonderful story.
Nice. Patrick's doing a Kent County big year this year, and it makes me so happy. Kent County big year. That's a great county to do it in.
I know. He's amazing. That was awesome. You used his photos. So I just wanted to say hello, and we love you and we miss you. And I'm trying to, I'm keeping in contact with Hawk and Hunter
Oh, nice.
because Colleen is taking care of them. So I'm watching out for all those animals.
That's good. That's good. Eva. And we are right now. We're kind of in a pattern of employment where we'll likely at least be back in Rhode Island for a short period of time in the winter, next winter. It depends on how long we can go with some other trips, but I'm working a seasonal job right now, so hopefully we'll be back. And I'd love to get back into doing the Bird in the Block Island ferry trip for the clubs.
Yeah.
Oh, that'd be great. If you want to do that through Audubon, Matt, if you and Susan want to do that through Audubon,
I can't go on the ferry trip. I will be seasick. But I can do something else for Audubon. But
Okay. But
I
if you
can't-
guys want to do something like and get paid like in Rhode Island, just contact me.
for
Possibly.
sure, we'll have possibly.
Paid is always nice.
I have I have to watch because I work for the Bureau of State Parks now, so I have a clause in my employment contract that I have to work out about what I can be paid for. Right now, it's nothing, but.
Well, then you always have Ocean State Bird Club.
Yep,
And then they'll just send it out to our Audubon people anyway.
yep.
Okay. Take care, my friends. Good to see you
Yeah.
all.
Yep,
Good to see you.
Matt,
Thank
thank you so much,
Matt.
Matt.
yep, no problem.
Thank you,
Thank
Susan,
you.
for being there.
Thank
too.
you, Matt. It was great.
Yeah.
Good to see you both.
Have a good night,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thank you very much. Take care.
See ya.
Bye, Matt.
Bye-bye.